So, Jeffrey, thank you very much for agreeing to come on my podcast.
My pleasure.
Yeah, you're going to be the first video episode that I actually release, as I'm not putting this in the pipeline. This is just going. The next one that I put out will be this episode, just to feel it's topical.
Okay.
So, well, I guess we just start with before we begin. I wanted to make sure we just lay out that for anyone listening, what we're going to discuss here is not us saying that we want to be callous and we want to say that, let's just let people die. Like, the genuine discussion we want to have is whether the trade-off between masks and lockdowns and all these measures that are being put in place by governments are worth it and are proportional to the threat and are not causing more harm than good. So I guess I just want to start by laying that on the table to make sure people don't think we're just saying, no, just let everyone die. That's a much better option.
One of the funny things about the lockdowners is that there's an ethos among these people that some people are entitled to be disease free and others are not. It's actually kind of grim. You've got this sort of overclass ruling class of Zoom-based workers, who can sit at home all the time, and it's actually despicable. This is not the working class. They love posting on Twitter, and they love lockdowns because it forces everybody else. I don't know if they think about it this way, but they're forcing everybody else in society to bear the burden of herd immunity. Given that we cannot, delete this virus from the history of the trajectory of the millions of viruses that have come unto us as human beings, and the pathogens are just a very much part of the social order, always have been. This virus has to go somewhere. And the way primitive societies deal with this kind of thing is that they segregate themselves. The elites hide and then force the workers and peasants and the slaves and the unclean to bear the burden of herd immunity until they build up immunities, and then the overclass doesn't have to confront the virus at all. Now, I still think it's a very bad solution, because what it means is that you're leaving people with naive immune systems that actually makes them more vulnerable to disease later. But from a sociological, economic, and even moral point of view, it's a grim and primitive way to approach viruses. I mean, this is how India developed a caste system, right? This is if you look at the way slave plantations in the 19th century worked, it was the way the South dealt all the time with diseases. Like, let the slaves get them, and they were sickly all the time. They had much better immune systems, but they were always sick, and so they had to bear the burden of disease. And it was true in the ancient world too, right? So the ruling class would always hide from the disease and force everybody outside the big cities to get it. And I mean, there's one of the extraordinary things. It's a typical feudal style approach to disease, very primitive. With modernity, with freedom and democracy and equal rights, we decided to use a fairer approach and to have a social contract in the presence of pathogens, so that no one group is more privileged than any other group, that we would not use the criterion of race or class or income or religion or language as a way of segregating society, but rather would use our intelligence to protect vulnerable populations regardless of their social status, religion, or whatever else. So we use an age-based focused protection policy, and otherwise, ask that the rest of society go about its normal business so that we can share the burden equally with all of us. So this is the way free, democratic, modern people deal with disease. Not in this case. We chose a much more of a medieval approach, which actually the New York Times recommended.
I mean, one of the odd things actually has been almost the complete alternative to the argument that you're making, in saying that by businesses who, for example, want to open up. I know this debate went on in my home city of Belfast. a few weeks ago, or not even last week, it must have been, when there was the restrictions that had been put in place were coming to an end, and there was discussion about whether it was going to go one way or the other. And right up until the last minute, the government hadn't decided whether they were going to allow bars and restaurants to open. And some restaurants and bars just came straight out and said, well, if you're not going to make a decision, we are going to open. And the immediate response from a lot of people, even though from a lot of people I've spoken to, they wanted to go out and work, like people who I know in the hospitality industry, were in places I used to work. Obviously, this is just the people I've spoken to, but they wanted to get back to working, and the narrative was painted that the owners of these businesses were sacrificing their workers. Like it was being like painted as if they were being sacrificed at the altar of the economy. Like these people were being sent out to their deaths because they wanted to work or because the businesses wanted to open. And it's such a paradoxical argument. I'm not quite sure how we got to the point where those who would be on the left, more generally, and would be the ones who tended to care about things like suicide and the fact that people of minority backgrounds or less well-off backgrounds have been worse affected by lockdowns in terms of mental health, in terms of like trying to perform their normal lives locked inside a house. And all of a sudden, the people who would normally come to the defense of the people who have been worst affected by the lockdowns are suddenly pushing for the most stringent regulations. It's such an odd situation we find ourselves in.
Yeah, it's very strange, and it's the opposite of the truth. I mean, the truth is that the people who are ready to go back to their normal life and take the risk, which, by the way, we can talk about what that risk is. But the people who are willing to take are, in fact, society's benefactors. Because, again, there is no such thing as a zero COVID world. That will not happen, not even when the vaccines get here. The goal of any policy in the presence of pathogen is to make every pathogen endemic, which is to say regulated or predictable and managed. And we're heading towards making COVID-19 endemic in most parts of the world. But in order to get there, you have to have herd immunity. And people who are willing to take the risk and get out there to contribute to that are, in fact, benefactors of society. And the people who are refusing to get out there because they think they're too good for it and they want the Amazon to deliver their foods to their front door and so on. Now, so to me, that's a tremendously selfish attitude, to just hide in your home. And then it makes it worse that you actually congratulate yourself, for pretending not to be a spitter or something like that. It's just everything has been completely upside down. And you say the economic costs of this thing are devastating. Do you know that in the United States we haven't had live music anywhere for a year? But you train your whole life as a musician, and suddenly you're forcibly unemployed. You're not allowed to delight people and do what you're born to do. Your calling has been abolished by the government. It's absolutely despicable.
Well, one of the trade-offs that essentially, I think this discussion, even on its own, is kind of not been encouraged or it's not been discouraged, but it's kind of been shied away from, is the fact that, okay, so the question we have to ask is the cost of a lockdown and the destruction of small businesses, especially of the livelihoods of everyone in the performing arts, especially, is that like that trade-off, not just now, but over the next 30, 40, 50 years, in terms of how long it takes for those businesses to come back, if they will at all, how long it takes children who are missing out on time, not only learning in school, but learning about social interaction in school, and how long that's going to take to recover from that, versus whether the deaths of every single one is obviously tragic. No one wants to lose a family member, but whether the people who would die from COVID or complications from COVID, is that trade-off worth the incredible, unfathomable, I think, long-term consequences of just shutting down the world for an entire year? And the reason I asked you on was initially to discuss this study that you wrote about, that was done by the US military, which kind of suggests that the lockdowns were essentially pointless, like that there was no need for us to do that, in order to that there was no way we could control like such an infectious virus that spreads asymptomatically amongst like large portions of the population. I mean, there's variation in the statistics as to how many people are asymptomatic who actually have it, but like, should we go into the military study and what exactly they said?
These studies are coming out almost every day. There was one that's just a brand new study out this morning with 6 high-end authors using all statistical correlations. Actually, so we've got some beautiful graphics and things in there. But they looked at and what we care about is deaths, right? I mean, that's severe outcomes from COVID. It's like, how do you minimize those? And they compared all these factors around the world that are correlated very highly with the rate of death. And they listed about 12 different things, from region, age, obesity, life expectancy, all these things. But one of the things they measured was government stringencies, what travel restrictions, forced closures of bars and restaurants and so on. And of course, I mean, like, I've read some of these studies now. I already know the conclusion of the study, but the conclusion of the study, and they said it very clearly, is there's no relationship whatsoever between lives saved at all and government stringencies. I mean, there's not even a correlation. So if you can't even generate a correlation, you can't even begin to think about a causation, right? So it's just not even on the map. And this is something like the 20th study that's shown this. This is just extremely bad science. The military study that you're referring to is a particularly interesting one. If I had been in charge, I would have done it differently. But they had a military enforced social, stringency lockdown, basically, with extreme social distancing. You're not allowed to get closer to 6 feet to anybody else, which is utterly ridiculous. And mandatory masks, very, very high-end masks, and they were really had like much stricter stringencies than you get in the normal society. And they divided the recruits into 2 groups. One that was willing to submit to testing, ongoing testing, and then followed by a positive test yields goes to isolation. The purpose of the study was to show that extreme stringencies plus testing and isolation can mitigate the disease. I think that's what was at issue here. And so the control group also faced stringencies, but they were tested at the end of 3 weeks rather than ongoing, and they didn't face the demand to be isolated from their roommate, such as the roommate is if you never get closer to 6 feet to this person. And so the idea was that, we can show statistically significant the extent to which imposing a military enforced totalitarianism with testing and isolation, can make this disease go away, right? So the results of the study published in the New England Journal of Medicine is that the group that was not tested, not isolated, actually had a lower rate of infection than the group that was. So, in other words, if the study shows anything at all, it shows that none of the stuff is actually that this test, trace, isolate, social distancing thing and mandates, lockdowns work at all. So, but it's funny that I wrote about this study first, and I found that the whole thing not surprising because I've just said so many of these things. But the New York Times actually, as they do often, they rendered it exactly the opposite conclusion. They said, New England Journal of Medicine, published a study that shows that testing isolation works. I don't know, it's gotten so bad at the New York Times. And there was this Danish mask study. I guess maybe you followed that. It came out yesterday.
Yeah, no, I was reading a little bit on the results of it. I haven't had a chance to fully delve into the.
Well, it's a complicated issue because the way the authors were forced to couch the language is so convoluted and confusing that that you can barely understand what it is they're saying. But you do get the sense that. They had, I guess, like 6,000 people, and 3,000 wore masks and 3,000 didn't. And then they tested them at the end of this period and found there was no statistically significant difference between the two. in terms of infections, right? So, which is interesting, because then they said, well, what this shows is that the masks do not protect the wearer, which is a fascinating conclusion, because America's Center for Disease Control had only very recently said that a mask is better than a vaccine. The guy actually said that. It's like unbelievable. So this contradicts that. I said, but it doesn't say anything about so-called source control, because you might still be spreading the virus. So, but you know what's funny about that conclusion? It's very parsed out. Like, I was trying to figure out, how would you come up with a similar study that checked the source control? I think you'd have to have two groups, and then each of those two groups divided between case positives and case negatives, and let them run around separately, one with masks, one without, and then check that at the end of 3 weeks. So maybe then you could test the source control. But a much more intuitive way to test this, more general question, which is, do masks work, is just to have half wear masks and half not wear masks. These are surgical masks, by the way, and see if there's any difference between the two. And the conclusion of the study is that there was no difference between the two. Mm-hmm. So the lead author of the paper actually made a colloquial statement to the press. He said, we wanted to test to see if masks work. Our conclusion is that they do not. So that's,
that seems fairly definitive from the author of the study.
This is my life. Every day is, this is like this blizzard of studies coming out, showing one after another that most of what we did in 2020 did nothing to reduce deaths. The deaths are associated with this disease, with age and comorbidities, which we've known this since March, since really February. We've known this, and that John Ioannidis, who Stanford University, said in middle of March, he said, we're about to embark on this grotesque social experiment with huge costs, with very little evidence that it's going to do anything to achieve the results. And earlier this spring, this guy who had performed all sorts of serological tests from his labs in California had come out with a statement that he thought that the infection fatality rate was far less than for people in the non-vulnerable groups than seasonal flu. And he was pilloried and attacked and actually denounced by his colleagues. And then guess what happened last month? His study was just published by the World Health Organization. And what he's proven is that there's an infection fatality ratio of 0.05% for anybody who's under the age of 70 and healthy. So that
is tiny.
Yeah, it's
like
small.
So hang on, 0.05%, did you say?
Yeah.
0.05%. So we need, obviously, that vaccine that is 94% effective, because that is better than our immune systems for anyone under 70 that are 99.95% effective.
Right. So it's basically, if you wanted to put it in plain terms, that's 1 in 2,000 exceptions to the rule that if you get COVID, if you're healthy and under 70, you get it, you're going to get over it. That's you'll be either be asymptomatic or get over it just fine. So that was the conclusion, and that's the best science that we have right now. That's what the World Health Organization says. So now we're getting this vaccine, and which is a very interesting thing. I'm glad the vaccine's there, and it's all good. I'm happy about it, but there's a couple of things to consider. One is, and every competent immunologist says this, that naturally acquired immunities are safer and more effective than any vaccine for a mild respiratory illness like this. And it's even true for other things. It's not even clear whether the chickenpox vaccine is better than getting chickenpox, if you get it young, and like we used to do in the old days. So there's that fact. And the other thing is that naturally acquired immunities tend to be a little more robust and sophisticated, in the sense that they can share immunities across a variety of illnesses, not just this particular COVID-19, but it might also grant you some shared immunities with flu, with other colds, with other things, and then those get burned into your T cells and live in your memories for years, if not your lifetime. Whereas vaccines tend to be more specific, related to a particular strain. And our vaccines are just not that intelligent. They've not been that intelligent with the flu. And that's why only 40% of people get the flu vaccine, because they'd rather just get the flu, take the risk and get the flu, because that you want to have a good, robust immune system. The other thing is it's only most of the time 30% effective. So maybe this will be 95% effective, but there's a problem here. That is that if the risk for people under the age of 40 or 50 or 60 or now 70 is so low, maybe you'd be better off just getting it. And it's a heck of a thing to say, but actually I've felt that way since February. I've never been scared of this thing, to tell you the truth. The other problem is, and this is actually a serious issue, and this was, again, sometimes I'm reluctant to name the names of people I talk to, because I don't know if they want to be quoted, but this is another infectious disease expert who actually works on vaccine efficacy told me this. He said, the really serious problem is that for many of the dead, some portion of the dead, maybe it's half, maybe it's 80%, maybe it's larger than that. The reason they die from COVID is they have non-functioning immune systems. Now, keep in mind that every vaccine requires that it attach itself. It's like a booster shot for your immune system. But if your immune system doesn't work, the vaccine will not work either. So there are surely some portion of people who have died from COVID-19 who had functioning immune systems that could have been benefited from a vaccine, but we don't know how many of those people there are. Now, it's certainly worth taking a risk and finding out, but it could be that for the most part, the vaccine will either be, for a large percent of the population, either unnecessary or unuseful entirely. That's just a fact.
So why do you think it is that the even saying that, like you mentioned a doctor there from California who had done some research and had suggested some things earlier in the year that then turned out to be true and was condemned by his colleagues. But even in the media, I've seen very, very, very little, like even acknowledgement that there is and has been since the lockdowns began a debate as to whether they're effective or not, and as to whether the cost was worth it. Even when the science was perhaps less clear in March and April, and this is why I was actually hesitant to have people on the show at that time talking about it, is because I just really didn't know. And the reason I want to do I've asked you on now is because I feel that it has to be said at this point, right? Because the evidence is there and is continually coming out, but yet there seems to be little to no debate in the media over this. Why do you think that is?
They had a narrative from the very early days, and one of the things you find from the mass media is that once they get their story, they just tend to stick with it. And a lot of this comes down to careers. Like within the journalism profession, what they do is they look at the high-end publications where they eventually want to work someday, where they want to land. Like if you start off as a local crime reporter, well, you start off in the obituary page, you want to get promoted to the crime reporter, right? And and then you want to go to a regional newspaper, then you want to go to a national newspaper, and so on. So everybody looks to the highest, most prestige journalistic outfits in the world and says, okay, I want to write things that are just like they write. And if you write something wrong as a journalist, this is true. You write a wrong story, you could lose your whole career for the rest of your life. So these people are really risk averse, so they tend to take their cues from the highest levels. And I knew we were in trouble on February 27th when the New York Times, instead of doing what they've always done in the presence of pathogens in the course of the 20th century, which is to calm everybody down, encourage people if they get sick to go see the doctor, otherwise go about their normal business, which is what the New York Times told us to do in 2006 and in 2002 and 2003, and then also in 1968, 69, 57, 58, and all the way back to the 1940s when we dealt, early 1940s when we dealt with the polio epidemic. The New York Times is recommending calm and normal social function. It's like responsible public health advice. This year was completely different. On February 27th, the New York Times did a podcast with Donald McNeil, their science reporter who has absolutely no background in science whatsoever. He has a degree in rhetoric from Berkeley. Predicted on this show, he said, unless we all just drop in place and isolate and live in our homes for months, there will be 6.6 million deaths in this country. That's what he said. And I'm it's first thing in the morning, I'm listening to the New York Times podcast, and I thought, you know what? This podcast just sent out a message to the entire American media that it's time to panic, and that we're going to panic as long as possible. And it was about at that point that I started turning it off, because I thought I can't learn anything from these people at this point. It just got stuck in their heads. Now, there could have been a political motivation, I think there certainly was. There's like, let's get Trump, let's whip up a disease frenzy, and then everybody will blame Trump for it. I think that might have been a factor here. But there's other deeper reasons too. One has to do with the fact that the modelers have become the modelers and these social distancing disease mitigators. They're not doctors. They're, for the most part, computer scientists. Have developed over the last 15 years an inordinate influence within the epidemiological professions, and they've been preparing for the next pandemic for a very long time. So the New York Times is talking to a lot of these guys that are out there, and they're still out there. But there's a lot of disagreements out there. The New York Times also ran in the second week of March an article by David Katz, who's an infectious disease expert. And he said, look, the worst thing we can do is lockdown. It's going to, the cure will be worse than disease. And the best thing you do right now is live your normal life, risk getting COVID, and contribute to herd immunity is get back to normal as soon as possible. That's what he wrote. So the New York Times ran that. But that was the exception. For the most part, they've been contacting these lockdown crazy people like Neil Ferguson and London. There's many of these people in the United States. And they somehow believe that they can manage the disease, and plausibly without any evidence. They think they could try this incredible experiment. The other thing is that the media is all the overclass, right? The blue check mark people who actually don't bear the burden and would rather not take the risk of getting the disease. So they're writing articles from their living rooms and puffy house slippers and enjoying their new lives and pretty happy with it. A lot of eyeballs, everybody's reading the press now, so there's a sense in which the media has benefited from this thing. I mean, look at the New York Times stock price. I mean, it's through the roof. So it's kind of, I don't think there's one reason why things have been so bad. There's just been a lot of reasons, but at the same time, I don't think that we're going to get through the rest of this year with this crazy narrative that lockdowns work in place, because the science is too clear. The truth is getting out there. I noticed, I've been anti-lockdown since January, right? I've been writing about this topic the whole time. But it was a lonely struggle in March and April, and then it started growing and growing and growing. Now, there's giant lockdown movements, anti-lockdown movements all over the world, in the United States, certainly, even though we're not out in the streets for whatever reason, I don't know why. But the street protests in Spain, Italy, and Germany, and even in Denmark, where they reversed a wicked law. And things are growing in Ireland, too. I don't know if you saw, we published this morning at the American Institute for Economic Research, a beautiful report signed by something like 60 scientists and doctors as prepared in Ireland about the disaster of lockdowns. And that didn't get a lot of attention, but I'm giving it more attention this morning by publishing it on our website. So we're breaking through gradually.
The Irish study sounds interesting. I will be sure to check that out, and I'll put it in the description for anyone that's listening.
It's the top item this morning on the AIER.org. We put it up there, published the whole thing. It's really good, really, really good. It just makes good sense. I mean, that's the thing about a lot of these. I'm described as anti-lockdown. It makes them sound like crazy radicals, out in the streets or something like this. No, this is just cell biology combined with good public health advice. That's all it is. We came out with a Great Barrington Declaration that was signed by Martin Kulldorff at Harvard and Jay Bhattacharya of Stanford, and the brilliant, ever so brilliant theoretical epidemiologist Sunetra Gupta at Oxford. And it was co-signed by another 40,000 scientists, right? And it was a very plain statement, not that long. It was like, 850 words or something like that, saying, we should protect the vulnerable and everybody else should go about their lives as normal. And do you know that thing has been trending in the news now for a complete month? I've never seen anything like it. I mean, just the amount of praise and the amount of attacks, the amount of hysteria and everything. All three of the authors get 1,000 emails a day asking for interviews and that sort of thing. It's a long struggle. Bhattacharya told me, I guess 2 days ago, that he thinks we're halfway to winning the debate, halfway there. So I think that's pretty good.
Well, that's pretty positive. I mean, the one of the things that really struck me actually is that I was watching an interview with Dr. Michael Yeardley, I think it was, and he was discussing the excess death numbers as like a good metric for understanding like where we were in terms of our progression towards towards herd immunity, essentially. And he thinks that half of the UK may have been immune in June. Because the excess death numbers were way up there in March and April at the height of the hospitalizations and deaths. But after that, there is essentially no excess deaths that have occurred. Like the amount of people that have died has been very consistent with our 5-10 year averages over the past like 5 months since the absolute peak of it. And his suggestion is basically like, people called herd immunity callous and like sacrificing those who decided that were the sacrificing frontline workers and people in bars and restaurants who would maybe be most at risk, like the people, like the front facing like workers of our society, like suggesting that was sacrificing them, when at the same time we may have already achieved that without even attempting it. And it kind of suggests to me that like actually I wanted to ask you, why do you think people have got the idea in their head that they can have like a zero COVID strategy as such? Like, why do you think we can? No, why do we think we can control something that is like that was from the very start like said to be incredibly infectious and an airborne virus? Like we've known that for months now, and we still seem to continue with this idea that we can control it. Like like that military study was a perfect example of why that's just a complete fallacy. But why do you think we have that in our head? Because I don't think I've ever experienced or read or had like seen any examples of where we think we could control something like that.
No. And one of the things we do need to understand is that there is this fascinating inverse relationship between severity and prevalence in any kind of pathogen. So, for example, Ebola is very angry but stupid, right? So it comes on and it kills, it shows up and it kills a ton of people, but then it can't, if you kill your host, you can't find any new hosts and the virus burns itself out. But COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2 is very intelligent because it doesn't kill its hosts typically, unless you're very old, unless you have a short life expectancy to begin with. This is generally true. There are always exceptions, and so therefore it's going to be widespread. So I think, just one more comment on SARS-CoV-1. I think a lot of people thought that the SARS-CoV-1 was in 2002 and 2003 and hit mostly the Far East. It never really came to the United States, but it was also a very, very, like I think it has like a 30% infection fatality rate. It was like something, it was truly terrible. A lot of people thought that SARS-CoV-2 was going to be a replication of SARS-CoV-1, except that it was going to come to the US. And so that, there was a lot of the statistical assumptions there were drawn from SARS-CoV-1. So that there's the idea that we got to suppress it because otherwise it's going to kill everybody. But again, this forgets this trade-off between prevalence and severity. The other thing that it forgets is the heterogeneity of the risk. Right. And so, like, if you look at Neil Ferguson's models or the IHME models coming out of the United States, they all assume a homogeneous risk across all population groups. And that's just completely false. So there's those two assumptions. But I think your question speaks to something a little more philosophical, which is like, I mean, if I'm going to summarize your question, it's like, how did we get so stupid?
I mean, I maybe wouldn't be that harsh about it, but
yeah. Well, let me just tell you a quick story because, and I might get the dates slightly wrong here, but this is very interesting. Apparently humanity does have variously, and is shown to have the capacity to forget what we knew. Like we'll have a settled science and people understand it, it's all public information, then it's gone. And the classic case of this is scurvy. So when travel on boats across large bodies of water over many weeks and months became technologically possible, they noticed that people started getting this strange disease with bleeding gums, and they eventually died. And then somebody discovered that the answer was vitamin C deficiency, which can be fixed through lemons, limes, and oranges and things like that. And so people started carrying those on boats, and it was very common. And so scurvy basically went away, and they realized what the cause and cure of scurvy was. Incredibly, about 300 years went by, and there had been no scurvy, and people gradually forgot the cause and the cure of scurvy, and people stopped bringing, fastidiously eating, consuming vitamin C products on boats. And scurvy came back, and nobody could figure out why. And months went by, really years went by, before people realized, oh, this is scurvy. We had this problem 300 years ago, and they fixed it through lemons, And so humanity had forgotten the science and had to rediscover it because the problem had gone away. So I tell that story because I think something happened in immunology and in our management of viruses that we got so used in the latter part of the last 25 years of the 20th century, so used to everything being cured by vaccines. And we developed a kind of what doctors call a mysophobia or a germophobia. It's like all pathogens are bad. Keep them all out. Give me shots to protect me from all pathogens. And we forgot how to have that little dance that we do with viruses that we've done for a million years. We forgot how to do that dance. And so this comes along, and it was not expected. Like, people had not mentally or psychologically prepared themselves for the presence of a pathogen. And instead of dealing with it intelligently, everybody just kind of panicked. I mean, not everybody. There's a lot of us that understood. I'll tell you, and ironically, older people have a much better relationship with pathogens. These are older people who understand that your immune system adapts in the presence of dangers and upgrades itself. When this first came along, I was going to see my mother, who's 80, and I was a little concerned about it. I thought, well, I don't want to bring her COVID, if I have it. And so I called her up and said, Mommy, I'm thinking about not coming, because she said, well, look, I understand why you say that. I would rather see you even if it takes the risk, because I love you so much. I'd rather take the risk. But if you don't feel comfortable with that, just wait. Give it a month, because what happens with these diseases is they spread very widely. Young people who are not vulnerable to it, obviously we know this, will get it. We'll get immunities to it, and then the threat will go away. Then you can come. So just give it a month. That's what she said to me. All right. Now, later I called her back and I said, Mom, how is it that you knew so much about this, whereas the New York Times virus reporters don't seem to know anything about it? She goes, well, I was taught that in ninth grade biology. And my mother was taught that too. And she said, I don't understand why people have forgotten these lessons. In the presence of a widespread and ultimately mild respiratory illness, the answer is to get over it and get immune and move on with your life. She was taught that. Her mother was taught that. It was a huge priority of the public health community after World War II to get people out of a medieval style mindset towards disease and upgrade and become modern people. Something happened. I don't think it was even my generation, because I think it happened right after my generation that people got really stupid about viruses. Because when I was in second grade, my parents excitedly announced to me that we were going to a party at a friend's house. And to my shock, the entire second grade class was there. And we all played and ruffled and tumbled, and we had fun together. And I came home, and the next day I woke up with red spots all over me. and my parents said, yeah, that's the chicken pox. And I said, congratulations, very happy for you. Here's some ice cream. You can watch TV all day. We're very happy for you. And I said, well, how can you be, I got red spots all over me. How can you be happy that I have a disease? I mean, how does that work? They said, I know it doesn't seem normal, but this is chicken pox. Everybody's going to get it at some point in your life. You need to get it now where it doesn't leave scarring on you, and then you develop this lifetime of immunities to it. So this is a good thing. So this is, for me, a really profound experience in my life, because it helps you, I don't want to say, helps you not be afraid. It helps you think more scientifically, you know?
Mm.
Well, to my shock, you know, maybe 10 years after that happened, 15 years after that happened, there's a vaccine. And the reason for the vaccine for chickenpox is they said, well, the problem with getting chickenpox is you can still get shingles later on in life. The vaccine protects both from chickenpox and shingles, so it's better than naturally acquired immunities. Okay, I can't really speak to that. Maybe that's true. But the problem is you have a whole generation, I would say basically everybody under 40, who never really developed a sophisticated view towards pathogens and diseases, and instead they just broke out into a fear. Maybe they're teaching this stuff in ninth grade biology, but they're, you know, instead of paying attention, they're checking their Instagram or something. I'm not sure what's going on. But you know, when this whole thing came out, I thought, well, yeah, I wonder what the textbooks say. So I downloaded all the books from Amazon. One of my favorites called Cell Biology for Dummies. It's a great book. It explains herd immunity, it explains immunity, it explains everything. It doesn't recommend lockdowns in the presence of a pathogen. It's ridiculous. And so I checked other first-year medical textbooks for students. I looked up herd immunity, looked up immunology, and the advice has not changed on the part of the profession. It's still the same as when my mother was a young girl. The problem is that people just don't know about it anymore. And this lack of knowledge has replaced intelligence with fear. And then that fear feeds into this acquiescence to go along with political power, and to let yourself be manipulated into thinking that the politicians can somehow solve this for us, which is completely untrue. But I would just say it was just a case of lost knowledge fueled by media panic and fear more than anything else. Look, I don't have the answers. It's going to be years of trying to figure out what the heck happened in 2020, you know?
Yeah, you can say that again. I mean, as long as we don't, as long as this is one of the most shocking and roller coaster years that we experience, like, you never know what's coming around the corner. Like, I guarantee that, like, I always make the joke that the people in 1938, when Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia, they were like, "Ooh, it can't get much worse than this."
I've been saying that almost every day all year. I mean, it's just, and, you know, as long as you bring this up, you know, it's been a big concern of mine, is the psychological cost. I mean, I feel like my cell phone has been a suicide hotline now for a good part of the year, you know, so, talking people out of their desperation and their sadness, you know, and that sadness comes about because of such a shocking changes in our life. You know, if you have a friend in Paris, he can't come visit you. You can't go visit Paris. You can't go to the movies. You can't go to Broadway shows. For a lot of places, you can't go to bars. And if you go to bars, you can't sit at the bar. You've got to engage in this crazy kabuki dance and sit around with plexiglass between. Everything's so crazy, and people's lives have been so shattered that, and their freedoms have been taken away, you know, and that's what leads to the depression and the despair. It's just a sense that, like, God, I used to think I had human rights and I had opportunities ahead of me and life was good. Now I don't have human rights. My freedoms are gone. Life is terrible. And people really sometimes wonder why they're going on. And we've seen skyrocketing suicides, you know, in a lot of places. It's hard to document this entirely, but a lot of anecdotal evidence. But we'll know within a year. Not to mention, you know, the one of the worst things that happened this year, and they're still going on, is that these politicians have decided how we're going to use medical services. So they're rationing medical services to spare them for COVID-19, even in the absence of cases or hospitalizations. The hospitals in the United States completely emptied out. 350 hospitals in the United States furloughed workers this year because they didn't have any patients, because the governors said the medical services can only be used for COVID-19. So no cancer screenings. And, you know, so-called elective surgeries were eliminated, and only non-electives, meaning that you have to be about to die before you can get to see a doctor. I mean, isn't it incredible that in the midst of a pandemic that we would see the underutilization of medical services like we've never seen in like 100 years? I mean, it's amazing. And then dentistry. Now, here's a very weird thing. I'll just tell you a quick story about this. I think it was back in the spring. I thought maybe I had a root canal I needed. It turns out I didn't, thank God, but I thought maybe I needed one. So I live in Western Massachusetts. So I called all the dentists in town and said, hey, can you do a root canal for me? No, it's not an emergency. We can't see you. Well, wait, are you a new patient? We can't accept any new patients. So I called like 15 dentists around. I couldn't get services. I thought, this is pretty strange. So I called up my mother, who lives in Texas. I said, Mom, listen, I have a really good dentist there. I may need a root canal, so I may take a flight in. She goes, oh, no problem, no problem. So she called up the dentist and said, hey, my son is going to be coming to town. Can you give him a root canal if he needs it? And they said, well, we can't really. He has to quarantine for 2 weeks before we can see him. And so I said to my mother, I said, in 2 weeks, a root canal can become debilitating. No, that's potential. And plus, I can't leave my work for 2 weeks and come down there and see as much as I'd like to. It's just not possible. So I said to her, well, how about this? You make the appointment for me. I show up the day before, and then you just tell them that I've been in Texas for 2 weeks. And she said, you want me to lie to the dentist? And I said, yeah, never mind, Mom. I'm not going to ask you to lie for me.
Yeah.
But it's a sudden weird realization I had that I had no access to dentistry, and which is, very much like the Middle Ages, right? So we did go medieval on this disease. We even got rid of dentistry.
I mean, as long as you didn't call someone to hit you over the head and do the procedure in your garage. I mean,
I think a homemade root canal would be pretty tough.
Probably. But like what you're saying speaks to something that I've been thinking about for quite a few months. And like one of the things I've been kind of concerned about, like not just this year, but over the last sort of year or two, maybe longer, but like it's only something that's really come to my mind was that like we've been talking about this loneliness epidemic and like the loss of social contact. And I've read a couple of books on like digital minimalism and like sort of rediscovering the joy and like actual mental and physical health benefits of spending time with people, like quality, like interaction, like something that's just been part of our species evolution for millions of years. Like it's literally the reason that humans like have spanned the planet and created all these wonderful, awful, fantastic, destructive technologies, is because we talk to each other, and like the communication and like just the benefits of having like social contact with people. And
Sure.
and kind of stripping that away is such a huge thing to remove from people's lives. Like no one has ever tried that, like ever. I mean, save for the Black Death, like literally save for that. Like no one has ever considered saying you cannot see your family, your friends, your work colleagues, just like you cannot see your social circle, and you're going to stay inside. Like just that was mind blowing to me. And when I started to realize that there wasn't actually that much justification for such a huge and like completely unprecedented undertaking, it really started to concern me a little bit. Like I remember when the pandemic first started, so I was working in Austria, and I got told to go home. We had to close the bar I was working in, and I came back, and my mum had tested positive, and I had to quarantine with her for a few weeks, and I think I'd already had it in February while I was working there, because I got hit with this horrendous flu. But I went back, and then when my mum first tested positive, I was concerned for her, because she's immunosuppressed because of the medication she's on for her arthritis. And I was really sitting thinking, like, what happens if she has to go into hospital, or her like lungs shut down? And there was this rule in the UK where, I don't know what it was like in America, but if your mother or father or any member of your family was in like an ICU ward, or they were in like a room by themselves, and their lungs were shutting down and they were going to die, they were literally going to die, that I was not allowed in that room. And I was just terrified at having to be dragged out of the hospital by the police because I was just like, I propose to you that you try to stop me. Like, you just please attempt to stop me saying goodbye to my dying mother.
Right.
And like, even that tiny example of things that were taken away from people is a really shocking, and it's dehumanizing in a weird way. And I'm concerned that we never get past this. Like, sometimes that we never get back to like real interaction with people.
That surely will change. I mean, I think there's going to be a big backlash coming, and sooner rather than later. So you mentioned the psychological costs of isolation and that sort of thing. There's also a medical cost to this, because we need to be around other people and diverse environments and strangers in cities, and we need to go to theaters and sit next to a person that we otherwise never sit next to, so that we can be exposed to a variety of so we can beef up our immune systems. It's really, really important. Sunetra Gupta made this point to me that after 1918, when international travel and immigration and trade really took off as never before, what happened was that the modal human immune system got massively stronger than it had ever been in the history of the world. So in the old days, immune systems were typically very naive, because we lived in much more isolated ways. And so disease couldn't spread all over the world. And so what happens with a naive immune system is the first pathogen that comes along, even if it's mild, wipes out the whole community. That's typical what happens to primitive tribes. That's happened to people all over the world for centuries and centuries. But in the 20th century, we really changed that precisely because of the interactions with so many different people from all over the world, that we had bacteria and viruses spreading all over the place, and our immune system adapted. And that's a major reason why we started living these long, long lives. And I mean, if you look at the expansion of lifespans in the 20th century, it's absolutely shocking. I was trying to make some adjustments. We were looking at the death toll in the United States for the Hong Kong flu in 1968-69. Okay, right now we live on an average of 78 years. Back in 68-69, we lived to like 68 years, and then you go back 10 years earlier, it was like 63, 57, 58. So once you adjust the death figures for deaths per millions of population and for the age differential, then you could argue that 57, 58, and 68, 69 were much, much worse than 2020. But one of the reasons that we're living such long lives is that we've gotten just healthier, better, and stronger through exposure. So we're reversing all that. And I've had serious disease experts tell me that they're very concerned about this winter, because there's millions of tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people who have spent the whole year in isolation, and their immune systems are getting worse and worse and worse, dousing ourselves with hand sanitizer, incessantly washing our hands until they're cracked and dried. And we're getting weaker and weaker. Now we're going into the winter months, the flu season and so on. And it could actually, there could be a tremendous human cost to this. We need the interaction, not just for our psychological well-being and economic health of our societies, but then it turns out, ironically, we need it for medical reasons too, to ward off disease.
Wow, I had not thought even that. I had not even considered that might be a possibility. Like, a friend of mine had like made a throwaway comment to me, like a few months ago, just about, he's like, yeah, we don't know like what sort of thing that we're setting off by trying something that we've never tried, in like the masks and the isolation. And he was like, yeah, well, we don't know what's going to happen with a disease when you do that. And I kind of just sort of dismissed it as like, well, I mean, that's just sort of idle speculation. But I'm pretty like shocked to find out that there's actually something to that. And coming from Sunetra Gupta, that's something that's taken quite
just
seriously.
Has this extraordinary vision. I'd never thought of that before, like that the strength of our immune system is substantially important for why we're living such longer lives now than it was in the past. So we're actually reversing the progress of history here in an immunological sense, So we could see excess deaths just go through the roof over the next few months. And whether anybody will realize this is due to the isolation that we've forced on so many people is another question. But medically, this is very terrible. One of the things that's so bad about this is that these disease mitigators and these modelers immediately went to the idea of isolation as the answer, whereas in fact the answer was and so then of course you had to get rid of sports events and gatherings and theaters and movies and that kind of stuff, because that's where people hang out together. But actually, that's probably the exact reverse of the advice. What you really want in the presence of a novel virus, as they say, every new virus is a novel virus, but is for these activities to continue on, so that we can upgrade our immune system. It's like downloading the latest version of iOS. You don't want to be running Windows 95 in 2020, and you don't want a 2019 immune system in 2021. You want it upgraded, and that upgrade can happen very naturally and very safely. And it was exactly that upgrade that we decided not to pursue. It was terrifying in this country. March 8th, we got rid of South by Southwest. This is a big conference that attracts something like 250,000 people in Austin, Texas. And they had just abolished it. They said, no, we're not going to have that. Well, I can just tell you, based on the demographics of fatalities of COVID-19, there wasn't anybody there who's vulnerable to this thing. There were nobody above 80 with comorbidities attending South by Southwest in Austin, Texas in March. That's completely crazy. There's mostly healthy young people. And, what's funny too, I don't know how much you follow U.S. news, but in the spring, we had spring break and all the students went out and partied on the beaches, and the news media clutching, oh no, look what they're doing, they're spreading disease. But there wasn't a single death. Well, there was one Uber driver, I guess, but there were millions of people doing this, and there was never any documentation of any fatalities as a result of that. In fact, it spread herd immunity and contributed in a benevolent way to helping get through this disease. So our governments have pursued exactly the opposite policies of what you want in these cases. I mean, and how many have apologized for it? That's the other thing that's actually alarming. Like what Boris Johnson has done to England is absolutely appalling. But he's not apologized for this. As far as I know, the only statesman in the whole world who's apologized and said, okay, we pursued the wrong policies was the Prime Minister of Pakistan. But he said, oh, that was a mistake. Locking down was terrible for the poor. I'm really sorry. I just panicked and I did the wrong thing. But as far as I know, he's the only one. But every one of these people has to apologize, from Boris Johnson to Andrew Cuomo to the governor of California, all of them. They all need to apologize.
I mean, Gavin Newsom probably more so than many.
Yeah, right.
He's imposing rules. Like he had he had a meeting of all of the California medical association at his house to discuss locking people down. Like he invited them round to decide that people wouldn't be allowed to be invited round to people's house. That was a special kind of.
And then you've got another problem in Australia and New Zealand, where they actually have, in a very selfish and wicked way, decided to lock down their societies and keep everybody else out, and deliberately try to create naive immune systems among their whole population. It's not worked. And every time they claim that it's worked, they're like, oh, look, we got rid, like this happened in Melbourne, I forget the guy's name, some dictator there, locked everybody in their homes for something like a month, and then drove cases down to zero and said, look, we won. And then they came back, and then they went away. And
there's a new lockdown in South Wales in Australia.
Yeah. So, and that was a very interesting case because they had internal travel restrictions for a good part of this year. So if you were in Sydney, you couldn't get to Melbourne. If you're in Melbourne, you couldn't get to Perth. If you're in Perth, you couldn't get to Adelaide, and so on. And so they opened up about 2 weeks ago some borders, and boom, just of course, they're a little hotspot of infections. 20, no deaths, just infections. They documented the existence of 20 infections. Immediately, South Australia locked down again and closed its borders. How are they going to keep this up? 5 years, 10 years? They'll destroy their entire economy. And same with New Zealand. Everybody thinks they did a good job mitigating the disease there. Nope. All they've done is isolated the population from the pathogen. I don't know how they think they can keep this up. They can't. Maybe they're waiting for a vaccine and they think that that's going to take care of it. I don't know. But this is egregious public policies. Let me say something real quickly about Taiwan, the case of Taiwan, because I think that's an interesting case. Now, if you just look at it on the face of it, I can't remember the exact data, but they had very, very low infections. They only had, I think, under 20 deaths in the entire country. This is a high population densities. And they did almost no testing. That's probably one of the reasons they had very low cases, but almost no deaths. And of all the states in the world, if you look at the stringency indexes, Taiwan was far lower than Sweden. They did almost nothing. There were no controls and very low mask use in the entire country. And COVID didn't bother them at all. So that's an interesting question. So I've been kind of looking into this. I assigned a graduate student here to find out what studies were done about it. But my intuition, based on what I heard from other scientists tell me, is they had a big outbreak of SARS-CoV-1 in 2002 and 2003. And it's a relatively healthy young population. But there have been widespread exposure to SARS-CoV-1. So you get shared immunities and T-cell memories from a very similar but much more severe disease. And that protected the entire population against SARS-CoV-2. So they had no stringencies whatsoever and the lowest death rate per million in the world. So it's a very interesting case where you can see the power of immunities here are much more significant than any government policies.
Mm. That is really interesting. Actually, I wasn't aware their death rate was that low. That's crazy. I mean, I think it probably speaks to the idea that there is probably far more factors than we are even considering at the moment that are contributing to where had a worse outbreak. It's probably nothing to do with the stringencies of the lockdown. And for example, I've heard some people talk about the air quality in certain places and the levels of air pollution, which are well known to contribute heavily to your prevalence to contract a respiratory disease. Mm-hmm. And people pointed to the fact that the area in Italy, whose name is completely escaping my brain right now, but the area in Italy that got really badly hit early on in the pandemic, that kind of made everyone else freak out, have generally quite a poor air quality there and high levels of air pollution, just because of the way that the valley tends to trap air between the cold air sitting on top and the hot air coming up the valley, and it tends to create this really poor air quality. I mean, the city I'm in right now, Innsbruck, they have the same issue, although they've had far less confirmed cases or deaths in the early part of the pandemic. But yeah, I feel like there's probably a lot more than is being considered, and the idea that we can control it is in
the case of northern Italy too, you had a demographic issue. You had a really aging population, one of the oldest populations in all of Europe, and quite frankly, a very unhealthy population. So a lot of people had very low life expectancies. Demographics matter a lot. I was comparing Sweden with his neighbors, and Sweden had a higher deaths per million than his neighbors. Sweden had very low level of stringencies. But it only took me a few minutes to Google around and find out that its neighboring countries had a much lower younger population. I can't remember the exact data, but it was surprising. It was instead of 20% of its population above the age of 80 or above the age of 70, it was something like 15%. So, and that almost accounts for all the differences in the deaths between the two countries. It's just a demographic issue.
Wow, I did not know that either. Yeah. Actually, something a friend of mine pointed to actually was the availability of ICU beds to treat in terms of like the deaths per million was the number of ICU beds that were available to treat people who got severe symptoms, being an indicator of how well a country dealt with it. But to sort of move towards wrapping up here, as I'm sure you're a busy man, you got lots of studies to read on, but just like, what would you recommend to any government right now? Like, what would be your suggestion for a move forward? Because I mean, you've said at the start there that you're not suggesting that we shouldn't try and protect demographics and people that are vulnerable to respiratory diseases, or COVID, for example, that plays on in some cases like previous or be unknown or underlying heart problems, can exacerbate things like that, and can like hit people who are vulnerable really badly and lead them to die. But like, what would you suggest is the way forwards at this point for policy?
We have to devolve decision making down to the units themselves. So, a long-term care facility has to be allowed to make its own decisions about how much risk they're tolerating from their residents. And they have to be aware, as they are very much aware now, not so much in the spring, but they're very aware now of the vulnerabilities of certain elements of the population, and they need to keep COVID-19 out of there. But everybody else needs to go about their lives so that we can quickly build up herd immunity, and so that we can allow older Americans to get back to normal again. That's always what we've done in the course of the 20th century. You know, there's nothing new about this. This is how we got through 2006 and 2009 and 2002, and how we dealt with the things in 68, 69, 57, 50. This is how we've always done things, and then otherwise let people assess their own risk levels and make judgments about themselves, and otherwise go about their business. I feel like if we just released all the stringencies immediately, people could make rational decisions and go about their lives, whether that involves wearing masks or not, or going out in public or not. Every magazine that's targeted towards older Americans for the last 50 years has had the same advice for people. Don't go into large crowds during the flu season, right? So we've known this already. And people are smart, people are intelligent. The problem is that we didn't trust people to make their own best judgments in this case. And we overrode everybody's decisions with the big central plans that haven't done anything. And governments have treated everybody as if they're all equally at risk, which is just not true. It's just completely untrue. So we need to get rid of the stringencies and as far as possible go back to normal life, so that we can make intelligent decisions to protecting the people who are actually vulnerable. And that's what I wrote in my book. I wrote a book that came out last month, Liberty or Lockdown, and it's entire history of this lockdown idea. I reconstructed some of the intellectual history here and went through a lot of the studies as I knew them then. The book's done very well on Amazon, and it's one of many anti-lockdown books that are out there. I tried not to make it depressing, so it's been a depressing year, but just an effort to help people understand what's happened and why. I don't think it's a result of some big conspiracy, a great reset, the communists taking over the world or anything like that. I think this is just a consequence of some terrible intellectual errors on our part, and we forgot what we once knew, and now we're having to learn it all over again in some of the most painful ways.
I mean, the funny thing about that great reset phrase is it's not new. It's something that was used by the Rand Corporation like 5 years ago to discuss. And then it became this thing that you weren't allowed to use that phrase, or you'd get shadow banned or banned on social media. And then after that, like in the last few weeks, loads of like world leaders have started using it to discuss it. It's amazing. It went from like a thing discussed by like people like trying to figure out the future of the world or where it's going to go. Like I don't know, if you're a pure conspiracy theorist, you call them the globalists. If you're a normal person or just on the street, you're going to call them billionaires. And then it became like a conspiracy theory term, totally banned, and now it's being used by world leaders. It's like that phrase has been on a roller coaster.
Right. And then Time magazine, the American magazine, Time dedicated an entire issue with something like 20 essays. Something.
Yeah. It's amazing.
So much for being a cranky conspiracy theory. Right?
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, that's a nice note to leave it on. So Jeffrey, thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks so much for listening. If you haven't already and you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to this podcast and to our mailing list. And don't forget, my book, Brexit, The Establishment Civil War, is now available for pre-order on Amazon. You'll find the link in the description below. Until next time, thanks so much for listening.